Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I apologize again for the delay tonight. The wrong link went out to many of you, and I apologize for that. My name is Christine Muir. I am the community librarian at Cary Library. All of the programming at the library is made possible by the Cary Library Foundation and its donors, so thank you to all of you. I am recording tonight's program, and I will post it to YouTube, and I will share the link with everyone who registered. So if anyone misses any part of this, you can watch it again. Zoom now offers closed captioning. You may have noticed subtitles at the bottom of your screen. If you find those distracting, you can disable them or hide them by clicking the live transcript button in the bottom menu of your screen. We will have some time for questions tonight. There will be natural breaks in the presentation where we'll stop for questions. You can enter a question into chat at any time, and I will read them to our presenters. If you want to ask your question verbally, just raise your hand and I will call on you and then give you permission to speak through Zoom so that you can ask it out loud if you'd like to. Tonight's program is part of our series on science and economics. It is my distinct honor and pleasure to work with Mr. George Burnell on these programs, which occur several times a year and always feature really interesting speakers on a variety of topics. I will now turn the virtual microphone over to George to introduce our speaker tonight.
Good evening, everyone, to the Science and Economics Speaker Series at Cary Library. This evening, we're honored to have author Lauren Aguirre, who is an award-winning science journalist who has produced documentaries, podcasts, short-form videos, interactive games and blogs for the PBS series Nova, where she worked after graduating from MIT. Her reporting on memory has appeared in the Atlantic, Undark Magazine, and the Boston Globe staff. Lauren has crafted an intimate tale of sweeping importance, one that travels the mysterious pathways of the mind. She gained the trust of all involved, the dogged researchers, the patients grasping at their fading memories. The result is a deeply reported, remarkable narrative. It's a fascinating subject. It's a fascinating tale, and it is a true mystery story. This will keep you up late at night until you finish the book, and she's here to tell us the story, and I think you will find it both entertaining and informative. Lauren, take it away.
All right. Thank you so much for inviting me. Thanks everyone for being here. I also want to thank the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation for public understanding of science, who helped support the writing of this book. And I also want to thank two Lexington residents who are in the audience tonight who appear in the pages of this book. One is Amar Sahai. He is a neuroscientist and Alzheimer's researcher at the Mass General Center for Regenerative Medicine. And the other is Jed Barash, who's the medical director of the Soldiers' Home in Chelsea. So the story at the heart of this book is about a tragic injury that happens to a very small subset of people who overdose on fentanyl. And what happens is that fentanyl zeroes in on the hippocampus, which is the memory center of the brain. And when these people come to, say in the hospital, they'll say, "What happened to me?" And they'll be told, "You overdosed." And then 30 seconds later, they'll say it again. "What happened to me? You overdosed." So they still remember who they are. They know that it's their mother, but they cannot lay down any new memories. So I was drawn to this story for very personal reasons because a little over a decade ago, I had my own experience with very frightening memory loss. For me, it was different. It was just a few minutes of not knowing anything at all, having no past memory, not even knowing who I was. And if you can imagine just for a minute how scary it would be to not even know your name. So when that ended, it turned out that it was a type of seizure. It was an aura. And I went to lots of experts for opinions. People recommended surgery. One of the experts I went to for an informal opinion was Jed Barash, who is not just a neurologist, but a friend. And he came over, he looked at the scan, and in his very sensible and practical way said, "This is no big deal. You don't need surgery. You're going to be fine. Just take your medicine and you'll be good." And he was right. I'm one of the fortunate ones. But it did leave me with an abiding fascination for weird brains and also a really profound respect for how terrifying it can be to lose your memory. So the story at the heart of the book is the amnestic syndrome, but it's a story that also illuminates many other stories, like how medical science advances, the basic science of memory, and then the quest to find treatment for memory disorders like Alzheimer's disease. And finally, the connection between this, what's called the opioid-associated amnestic syndrome and Alzheimer's. So I'm going to divide my talk into 3 sections, and the first will be about the syndrome. The second will be about the science of memory, and the third will be about Alzheimer's. And so in between, you'll be able to ask your questions. And now I'll start with a short reading. This is from very early on in the book. On the first Friday of October, Barash leans forward in his chair and stares at the MRI scan on his monitor. He's looking at the brain of a young man admitted to the hospital last night, and the image is so strange and beautiful that he knows something has to be wrong. "Whoa," he says out loud to his empty office. "This is weird." Floating brightly against the darker background of the rest of the brain are 2 C-shaped structures tucked on either side of the central fluid-filled cavity. Together, they make up the hippocampus, the place that holds the keys to memory. And the intense glow is a distress signal from many millions of cells. Some mysterious marauding force has laid waste to just this tiny region, leaving the rest of the brain unharmed. Barash looks out his door to the still quiet waiting room up on the 7th floor at Leahy Hospital Medical Center in Burlington, Massachusetts, just outside Boston. Then he looks back at the monitor. Last night's phone call from nearby Winchester Hospital requesting permission to transfer this patient suddenly makes more sense. The distraught 22-year-old had recently overdosed. He was dragging one leg and repeatedly asking his mother if he was dying. Winchester is a smaller hospital that handles routine emergencies, like a broken wrist or an appendicitis. But when patients with complex conditions or unexplained symptoms come in, the staff will often send them over to Leahy, a facility that has hundreds of specialists and more equipment. With a high-quality image in front of him, Barash can see what the Winchester staff could not, and it explains why the patient was acting strangely. In 10 years of medical training, Barash has reviewed thousands of scans, brains shrunken from Alzheimer's disease, brains dotted with tiny broken blood vessels, brains with tumors in different sizes, shapes, and locations. In every case, no matter what the damage looked like, it was pretty clear what was going on. But what Barash sees on the screen in front of him is strange and alien, belonging to no category he can imagine. It looks like someone took a page out of his medical school neuroanatomy textbook and deliberately highlighted the brain's memory center. He re-examines the MRI, scrolling up from the base of the skull through the familiar soft gray brain structures until the hippocampus comes back into view. It seems certain that this patient will fail the memory tests they'll give him today, and the damage has triggered Barash's interest in strange cases and rare brain diseases. He believes more in chance than in destiny, but still, he thinks, it's almost as if his years of study and obsession have guided him directly to this moment, sitting in this office, looking at this startling image. The care of this patient is now with his colleague, Yuval Zabar, a neurologist Barash admires for his intellectual curiosity and ability to run through every diagnosis that could possibly explain a patient's symptoms. It's Friday, the final day of a week being on call, and Barash is allowed to leave for the weekend at noon to make up for the last 7 nights of fragmented sleep. But instead of heading for home, Barash turns off the monitor, pulls on his white doctor's coat, and heads down to 6 West to join the neurology team on their daily rounds. He has to see the patient for himself. So, can you move forward, Christine? I'm not able to for some reason.
So you may have to use the arrows in the bottom left-hand
There
corner.
we go.
Yep.
Gotcha. Okay. So this is what that brain scan looks like. This is actually a scan from a different patient, but they all have this characteristic look. And this is the view looking from the top, from the crown of the head down through to the skull. So those glowing bright squiggles on either side are the hippocampus. And here's another view from the side looking towards someone's ear, and they're looking off to the left, and that red thing in the middle is the hippocampus. So indeed, Max Meehan is the name of this first patient, had no ability to form new memories. It was the same thing. His memories lasted maybe 30 seconds, and then they had to start all over again. And the doctors at Leahy had no idea what was going on. It looked a bit like a stroke, but strokes don't target just that one area specifically. So they had to send Max home, unfortunately, without a diagnosis. And he had to move home with his mother. He had to drop out of school, and he couldn't hold down a job. But this was a fluke, and really hard to know what to make of it with just one case. And it was another couple of years before another patient showed up in Jed's office at Leahy. And a few months earlier, his family had gone away for the weekend, and he'd stayed home alone. And when they called on Saturday, he was fine. And when they called on Sunday, he was making no sense. And just like Max, he just couldn't remember anything new. So now, 2 months later, it was the same thing. And he came to Jed's office, and afterwards, when Jed pulled up the scan on his monitor, it was the same exact sort of beautiful but strange image. And one thing that's interesting is that the radiologist who looked at this in New Hampshire, which is where the second person was from, didn't flag that, even though it's so unusual. And it's possible that it looked so perfect in a way that the radiologist thought it was a mistake. But in any case, at this point, Jed had 2 data points to go on, and he said, what's the common link here? And the common link was heroin, because the second person also had a history of heroin use, as did Max. And but people have been using heroin for decades. So what's changed? Well, what had changed is that fentanyl was working its way into the drug supply in Massachusetts, beginning in about 2012. So maybe it was fentanyl, but still 2 patients isn't really enough. And the question was, well, how many patients are out there? If we've already seen 2 people in this one hospital, maybe there are a lot more people. So Jed took that question to the CDC, and they responded that it could be any number of other things. They didn't seem to feel the same sense of urgency as he did. One of their suggestions was that it was amnestic shellfish poisoning, which is another rare syndrome where a toxin attacks the hippocampus, but it only happens in the summer months after algal blooms and the shellfish accumulate a toxin that can hurt the hippocampus. He also went to the Department of Public Health, to the state epidemiologist Al DiMaria, who said, that's really interesting. Let me know if you find a couple more cases. So Jed and a few other neurologists and radiologists who were trying to sort this out started looking back through the Leahy records. And about 9 months later, they had found 2 more patients. So they went back to the DPH, and the DPH said, yes, okay, we need to send out a request and see who else is seeing this. And so they sent out a request saying, if you've seen this strange imaging and the patient has amnesia and it's possibly associated with opioids, but we're not sure, please report it. And within minutes, they got their first report back. This was from a neurologist at Beth Israel who says, I was involved in such a case of a 49-year-old patient. He was found confused and amnestic, imaging with bilateral hippocampal injury and tox screen, positive for opiates, which he denied taking. So ultimately, they got about 25 reports of possible cases and had to whittle them down because there was so much missing information, which has been a challenge all the way along with this syndrome, because either the imaging doesn't get done in time, or there's not proper drug testing, or the person disappears before they can be tested to see what their memory's like. But ultimately, they wound up with 10 patients. So adding that to the original 4, they had 14 patients, with a common link being opioid use. This time, the CDC agreed that this was something important and something to share. So they agreed to publish their report in the CDC weekly report, Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report. And then the word got out, and there was a lot of media attention on it. So the thing is, though, as interesting as that is, they still didn't know what caused it. So the hunch was that it was fentanyl, but they didn't know. And one of the reasons it's important to know, and one of the reasons that Jed and other neurologists were so interested in tracking this down, in addition to needing to know how many other people were out there, is whenever you see something strange and new that doesn't make sense, it's an opportunity to figure something out that wasn't known before. If it doesn't make sense, it means that your understanding of the system was incomplete. And there was a case back in the 1980s that was similar, in which, again, heroin addicts used a bad batch of drugs. And all of them, there were 5 or 6, developed soon afterwards symptoms of advanced Parkinson's. And up to this time, there was no way to test drugs for Parkinson's because there was no animal model for Parkinson's. You need mice who have something like the disease you're interested in treating in order to test drugs. And so by figuring out what the specific toxin was in the contaminated drugs that these people took, they were able to create the first ever mouse model for Parkinson's, which was really pivotal in the quest for a treatment. So that was one of the hopes in this case. And so, but how to find out if it was fentanyl? Because despite the fact that there were 14 patients, not a one of them tested positive for fentanyl. And the reason none of them tested positive for fentanyl is because none of them were tested for fentanyl. Despite the fact that fentanyl is responsible for the bulk of opioid overdose deaths, it's not routinely tested in hospitals when someone comes in for an overdose. And that's because it's expensive and it usually has to be sent out. And also, people usually have many drugs on board. Fentanyl is often mixed in with heroin or Xanax or cocaine. Most people who overdose are taking more than one drug. And so it was going to be pretty tricky to figure out if people were taking fentanyl. And there were basically 3 ways to go about it. One is that at the office of the chief medical examiner, that is the one place where they do routinely test for fentanyl if someone overdoses and dies. And so Jed's thought was, well, if there are people who have tested for fentanyl and also had an MRI scan, maybe we can get some data there. After meeting with the chief medical examiner, they decided that was sort of a research project that wasn't appropriate and wouldn't work out. Another strategy would be to keep digging through the online literature and see, is anyone else seeing this same thing associated with opioids? And in fact, not long after the MMWR report came out, one of Jed's colleagues, Yuval Zabar, found such a case. Same amnesia, same bizarre brain scan, although the person had overdosed on amphetamines. So Jed got in touch with him, called him up in West Virginia and said, did you screen for opioids? Do you think it could be fentanyl? And the doctor said, didn't occur to me. And Jed said, well, if you see another patient like this, please see if you can screen for fentanyl. And in fact, not long after, another patient did turn up. They were able to screen him in time, and he did take fentanyl. He also took a lot of other things. So it was still not possible to say that it was fentanyl. So then the third approach was to go back to the DPH and say, can we put out another request and specifically ask if people are able to screen for fentanyl? So they did that, sent it out again to doctors across Massachusetts, and within a few months had 4 cases of these patients, all of whom had taken fentanyl. 3 of them had taken other things as well, but 1 of them had taken fentanyl alone. There was still always also the possibility that it was a toxic contaminant, even though that seemed unlikely by now because it was spread across so many years. But then in 2018, a woman in Canada, an older woman who was prescribed fentanyl patches for pain, used 2 of them in one night and developed the same amnestic syndrome. And this is a journal entry that she wrote because she was unable to remember anything. It's a little hard to read. She says, feeling even more confused today, no sense of time, anxious, feel like I'm in a fog. Have to keep reading my journal and whiteboard to remember anything. Memory does not hold. So now that they had a better sense that it was fentanyl, they still didn't know the extent of the damage to the hippocampus because most of the patients had disappeared or in some cases passed away, and they didn't have the kind of high-level imaging that you would really need to get. And they didn't know in detail just what the memory impairments were like and what was spared. So also in 2018, a young man whose story I tell throughout the book, who had a long-standing bizarre relationship with memory for years before he overdosed, had an experience where he, well, it's a sad story, but basically he had been so worried for years about losing his memory that he kept daily lists and journals. He spent hours every day documenting what he had to do and documenting what had happened to him. And he had also been misusing drugs since the age of 11, including opioids and progressing to fentanyl. But finally, he had succeeded in being sober for 18 months. But it was always a struggle for him. And then he began to experience these strange auras of synthetic burning smells that no one else could smell. So he went to the doctor, got a brain scan. The doctor said, I think there's a tumor, but we're going to need to get another scan to be sure. And this young man, who I call Owen, contrary to being scared, was, as he told me, ecstatic, because this would give him the excuse to go back to using fentanyl or other opioids without anyone being mad at him for doing that. So I'm going to show you one of his journal entries to show you kind of the state of mind he was in just before he overdosed. If nothing matters, we contrive meaning for ourselves. So why can't mine just be something that soothes me so that I can live here more peacefully? There are pressures from every direction saying that using drugs is unacceptable. And I understand most of them, but I still think that that's been the best solution for me so far. So then Owen got the message that actually he didn't have a brain tumor, and that was the night he went out, overdosed on fentanyl, and woke up in the hospital with amnesia. A few months later, he sort of emerged from his fog, found an article that I'd written about the syndrome, got in touch with Jed, who put him in touch with a neurologist at UC San Francisco. And Owen, hoping to make some sort of meaning out of his tragedy, agreed to participate in research there. So they were able to do a very detailed brain scan. They found that his hippocampus shrunk by about 10%, which is as much as the average 60-year-old would lose in a decade. And also that his episodic memory, his ability to form memories for new events, and his explicit memory, his memory for new information, was on par with that someone with Alzheimer's. But aside from that, he was perfect. And because he had this ability to write lists and manage his life, and he is a very, very bright person, he graduated with a 4.0 from a prestigious university, he still scores quite well on the rest of the exam. So one of the questions that occurred to these neurologists as they were going along is, okay, so if fentanyl can damage the hippocampus very acutely, very quickly, very severely, what about people who are taking fairly high dose opioids over long periods of time as prescribed for chronic pain control, especially older people who are more vulnerable and who are prescribed opioids at a higher rate than others? Might there be some subtle memory problems that are going under the radar? So that is one of the questions that has come out of this syndrome. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to questions. And you can ask either Jed or myself.
So if anyone has any questions, you can enter it into the chat, or you can raise your hand and I can call on you so you can ask it out loud. And we'll just give it a minute for people to think about that. And if no questions come in, we'll go on to the next section. You can ask a question even at the end of the program about any of these sections. There's just a lot of information in each section, so we wanted to give some time. So we had two come in to the chat. Should we be concerned about fentanyl being used in procedures?
No.
Is that a question for you, Lauren, or for Jed? Because at the moment, I just have you spotlighted for people. So if Jed's going to answer a question, let me know and I'll bring his camera up for people as well.
Jed, do you want to answer it? Oh, he's on mute.
You can start if you want, and I can.
Okay. So no, people should not be concerned, and fentanyl does not cause Alzheimer's, just to be perfectly clear. So fentanyl is one of up to 10 drugs that are given during surgery, but it's given with another drug that has an effect that would counteract the mechanism that is believed to be behind the damage that's happening in these people with the amnestic syndrome. And I think that if fentanyl caused this, we would know about it. There would be people all over the world who had lost their memories after surgery.
Yeah, I'd also add, you know, in surgical procedures, you have generally have airway protection. So they have a breathing tube in place, and they, you know, monitor your blood pressure and your oxygen. You're not deprived of oxygen that's going to the brain, which is kind of one component of the issue with the syndrome, is that people, it's not only that the fentanyl is toxic to the hippocampus, but at the same time, you know, the hippocampus, the metabolism of it's going into overdrive, and there's not enough oxygen going to the brain, because when you're overdosing in the community, there's no, you know, there's no airway support or supplemental oxygen going to the person. So they wind up burning through their, you know, basically burning through their energy supply much more quickly. And that's what we hypothesize causes the, you know, the syndrome. So it's kind of the combination of the two.
I don't want to give away the end of the book, but while we're talking about fentanyl, my mom had to take it after going through chemo and radiation 15 plus years ago. And knock on wood, she never had any problems in any way. She didn't experience memory loss. She didn't experience any kind of addiction or any side effects that I know of, you know, beyond maybe what you might normally get with medication. Do you think that it affects different people differently? And are you looking for some kind of predisposition to the impact?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that's one of the big questions that comes up is, you know, why, you know, you have, you know, many, you know, thousands and thousands of people are overdosing on fentanyl, and you have, you know, a relatively small number who are, you know, experiencing the syndrome. And the question is why that might be. And, you know, there's probably, you know, we suspect some sort of genetic component. It's a little hard to assess in a rare syndrome, because you have to accumulate enough enough of a sample size to make meaning of it. So that's kind of one of the issues that I think would be an interesting study if we could ever kind of accumulate enough, enough data points to look at, to see if there's some sort of interaction between the exposure and the genetics, as there are for some other known kind of toxin related syndromes.
Makes perfect sense. So somebody else asked, what about OxyContin?
So so I guess this goes back to it's hard to tell what people are taking. I think some people are taking drugs that they think are maybe OxyContin or something else, if they're purchased obviously from a non-pharmaceutical source in the street. They're taking something that they think might be OxyContin, but winds up being fentanyl and mixed with other with other substances. We don't have any evidence that somebody taking just like prescription OxyContin develops this syndrome. I guess it's plausible that an overdose of OxyContin or other opioids could possibly do it, but the strongest link we have is to fentanyl. When we look at all the data together.
Somebody else asked, why is just new memory affected but not old memory?
So I mean, I think that tends to be so it's similar to when you see in Alzheimer's is people have trouble forming new memories, and they have a good almost like anchor for the older memories, and that seems to be characteristic of the damage to the hippocampus, basically. So people tend to have stronger anchoring to the older memories, and it's the newer memories that aren't as well anchored, and that's what it seems to affect the most. They do actually have some what we call retrograde amnesia, which is they do have some loss of memory looking back, but it's usually for maybe a week or give or take, maybe leading up to the event, or days. It's just not as dense as going further back beyond that.
There's one more question, and then we'll move on to the next section. And like I said, people can certainly revisit topics at the end of the program as well. So this question is, I've heard comments and concerns about anesthesia and memory loss when people over the age of 80 have surgery. Is this related?
Well, I'll let Lauren probably knows more than me about that. She wrote an article about it, so I'll let her comment on it.
Okay, well, the answer is, am I back on?
Yes.
Okay. The answer is we don't know. Actually, I did write an article about this for Nova, and I went to an anesthesiology conference and asked every anesthesiologist, because there is a concern that some older people have memory problems afterwards. For most people, it resolves, and for a very small percentage, it appears to linger. And it's tricky to sort out because all sorts of other things are going on at the same time with surgery. So it's not even clear that it's the drugs. But in any case, none of the anesthesiologists had actually been looking at fentanyl. So to date, to my knowledge, that small piece of the puzzle has not been looked at least not yet.
Great. Well, thank you for answering questions on that section. We can move on to the next section, and we'll come back for more questions as they arise.
Okay. And just to confirm, we're ending at 8:30?
Correct.
Okay. So I am probably going to breeze through the science of memory, which is kind of laughable because it's a huge, huge topic. And I'll start with another short reading.
And if people want to stay and you have more to add, Lauren, because we started late, I am open to staying a little bit longer, so I don't want to cut you short at all.
Okay. Memory has 3 stages: encoding, storing, and retrieving. If any one of them fails, an episode from 3 days or 3 decades ago will be missing from your personal story. In an obscure natural experiment that began on an operating table 3/4 of a century ago, hints emerged that vanished memories could be found. Inside a turreted gray limestone building on a hilltop in Montreal, Dr. Wilder Graves Penfield gently lowers an electrode onto the glistening surface of the patient's right temporal lobe. She is a 32-year-old woman with severe epilepsy. Suddenly, she speaks. "I hear singing." Penfield lifts the electrode briefly, then lowers it again. "Yes, it is White Christmas," she says. Penfield waits for his assistant to place a small white paper square with the number 15 to mark the spot before moving the tip of the electrode 1/4 of an inch or so away. That is a different voice, a voice, talking, a man. Penfield lifts the electrode and the assistant marks the spot with a paper square numbered 16. Penfield discovers 8 locations that each evoke different auditory memories: a radio program, a play, a violin. 26 minutes after the patient hears the song White Christmas, Penfield returns to location 15 and lowers the electrode again. Again, she tells him the orchestra is playing White Christmas. So that raises a lot of questions. This surgeon, Wilder Penfield, believed as a result of this that memories are stored like tape recordings or film recordings, sort of immutably. And with the right stimulus, you can pull it back up and it will replay itself for you as if you were back there in the moment. And we know now that that's not true. But there is a whole host beginning in the 1920s. The kind of the quest, the search for memory. Where does memory live? How long can you hold on to a memory? Can you actually find memories that appear to have been lost? How many neurons does it take to make a memory? How many neurons can you lose? But really the basic question is, what does a memory look like in the brain? And the name for that is the engram. And it was coined by a German zoologist named Richard Seaman in the 1920s. And he actually had a very sophisticated and far ahead of his time view of memory. He did not believe that it was like tape recordings. He actually thought memories were distributed in patterns across the brain and that they interacted with each other and they could contaminate each other. And that when you recalled a memory, you were changing it. And he turned out to be right. But what memory looked like in the brain, he couldn't say. He didn't have the tools. So the next sort of engram hunter to pick up the quest was an American zoologist named Carl Lashley. And he went about it very methodically with a rat or multiple rats, basically trying to snip different pieces of brain tissue. And this was at a time that no one knew the hippocampus had anything to do with it. So snipping different parts of brain tissue. But no matter where he cut, he could never get rid of the memory. So memory seemed to be at once everywhere and nowhere. But today, with the help of modern technology, engram hunters actually can find memories and they can tag them and they can manipulate them. So this is an example of an engram. This is from the lab of Steve Ramirez at Boston University. And this is a teeny tiny piece of the hippocampus, and the glowing green bodies below the blue line and above the blue line, those are the neurons that have been tagged so that they're tagged during the formation of a memory so that when you later shine light on it, those neurons will show up and be reactivated. So sort of on demand, you can call back a memory and then you can infiltrate that memory with other information to change the quality of that memory. And this is something that could potentially be useful, let's say, with other memory disorders like PTSD or anxiety or depression. And it's one of the reasons why fundamental neuroscience is so important, because it can point the way to possibilities that might someday be treatments. But now I'm going to go back to our friend the hippocampus. And this is a picture that was drawn by Santiago Ramón y Cajal probably the early 1900s. And this is from a rat hippocampus. It shows how intricate the structure of this little piece of brain tissue is. And Cajal and his colleagues didn't know what the hippocampus did. They thought it had something to do with emotions, which is true, but we now know that it does so much more. And the reason we know that is because of another tragic accident. And this is the story of HM, a young man who had terrible seizures, couldn't be treated with drugs. And so in a last-ditch effort to save him from his seizures, a surgeon decided to remove both of his hippocampi, which sounds pretty crazy, but there was a good reason to try that because neurologists knew that the hippocampus is often the source of seizures. It's a very delicate and very excitable part of the brain, but no one had ever removed both. And so when HM woke up, you know, he was just like Max or the other people. He knew who he was, he knew his mother, but she soon noticed that he just couldn't remember where the bathroom was or anything else new. So he was the classic patient, probably one of the most studied patients in neuroscience. And that's how they learned that the hippocampus is essential for forming new memories, what are called explicit memories, memories for events or memories for new information. And, but what scientists soon discovered is that memory isn't just about remembering the past and your grandmother's amazing blueberry pie and all of that. It's also about imagining the future and predicting the future. So a neuropsychologist in England named Eleanor Maguire did some very interesting experiments with people with amnesia, comparing them to people who did not have damage to the hippocampus. And what she found was if she gave them an exercise like, tell me about a day at the beach. What do you see? What's happening? The people without amnesia will tell you a whole story. You know, my kids are screaming. I can hear the seagulls. I smell the sunscreen and I'm worried about lunch. And the people with amnesia, it's very, very lacking in detail. So they'll say, I can see the blue sky. I see the white sand, but that's about it. It's kind of like I'm floating. So if you can imagine, not being able to project yourself into the future is also as debilitating as not being able to lay down new information. So what does the hippocampus do? This is or how does it do it? This is the subject of many papers. This is, again, Wilder Penfield. He was the one who did the experimental surgeries where he uncovered memories. And this was his concept of what the hippocampus does or how it is responsible for calling up memories. And he called it the keys of access. So he didn't think that, that the hippocampus is where all memories were stored, but he thought that that is where the information about where the memories are stored is, and that the hippocampus then pulls it all together in the right order to make a story. So different scientists talk about it as being maybe a binding machine that pulls together associated information, which could also be related to language. It wouldn't have to be an episode. But at the end of the day, we certainly now know that without a functioning hippocampus, you can't make a new memory, and the story of your life becomes very, very impoverished because you're stuck in the moment while everyone else moves forward. So that was my 30-second view of the science of memory, and we'll take questions now.
So we'll give people a minute again if they want to put something into chat or the Q&A box or raise your hand. While we're giving people a minute, I always have a question. I think that's why it's so great to be a librarian. And I may bring Jed back to this one. It's interesting. I guess I'm looking like contextually in the broader context. It's interesting that so much of this information about the hippocampus seems new and surprising. So not being in the neuroscience field, how well do we know the brain as a whole? And is this just an area that hasn't been studied a lot, or is there really a lot of function within the brain that we don't know about yet?
You want to go?
I think Amar should go.
Yeah, Mars. All right,
Okay,
Mar.
I will bring him up too.
Well, sorry, could you just quickly repeat that question, Christine?
Yeah, contextually, how much do we actually know about the brain and how it works and all of its individual pieces? Is it just the hippocampus that hasn't been studied a lot, and this is a new area where we're learning a lot more, or just looking at the field as a whole, because I don't have a lot of experience in it. It seems like this is a lot of new information. So is it the context in which we're discovering the information, or is it that this part of the brain hasn't been studied a lot, or do we not know a lot about the brain as a whole?
I mean, I think we do know a lot about the brain, but there's a lot that we don't know as yet. And, a lot of observations in the hippocampus, as Lauren pointed out, were made in the clinic. And, those observations have been borne out at the level of circuits in the brain and through the tools of modern molecular neuroscience and electrophysiology, and even newer innovations like optogenetics. And so with all of these new innovations in technology, we're afforded a much greater granularity about how these circuits work in the brain. And so, the field of memory is actually very rich, and it's rich in many layers. You've got psychologists, you've got clinicians, you've got neuroscientists, and so you have many layers of observations. And so it's actually not that young. It's, at least 30 years of observations, but it's just that every year with new innovations and technology, we have greater insights, much more precise, more granular, and consequently our knowledge about the hippocampus becomes, even more sophisticated.
It's really a fascinating field, and my kids always get upset with me because every time I read about a new career, I'm like, I want to be that. So now I want to study neuroscience, but it feels like it's a little overwhelming. But it's fascinating, so I'll keep reading the books that you all write and the studies that you publish. So we have two questions in Q&A. One is, how does sleep affect the function of hippocampus?
Do you want to take that, or Lauren?
Well, you guys are the experts. For myself, I know that it is a bad thing, personally, for sleep, for memory. So yeah, I think it's a problem, but I'll let either one of you answer that.
Well, so I can, there's a lot of work that's going into how fragmentation of sleep affects memory consolidations. Memory consolidation is a process by which memories that are registered in the hippocampus are subsequently transferred for storage in a part of the brain called the cortex. And we know that fragmentation of sleep disrupts this transfer of memories from the hippocampus to the cortex. So sleep is really good for you, and sleep does facilitate or help with the storage of memories. And that's why empirical wisdom suggests, it's a good idea to sleep the night before an exam rather than try to study all night and take the exam the following morning. You're more likely to perform better. But most of us in college didn't do that. Those who did probably did much better. It's a good idea to sleep so that information that you've recently acquired is successfully transferred from the hippocampus to the cortex. And this is a very active area of research. In fact, sleep disturbances are thought to underlie many memory disorders associated with cognitive decline, but also psychiatric disorders. So people are really interested in, what happens during sleep at the level of synapses, the level of circuits, and how different brain regions communicate with each other during sleep when sensory information is essentially shut off so that the brain can continue to replay information that we've acquired during the day.
It is definitely a fascinating area. I think we could stay here all night. So So this question is coding, storing, and retrieving components of memory. It sounds like a computer's CPU, central processing unit. Would you agree?
Well, yeah, I 100% agree. The hippocampus is an encoding device. The cortex is like your hard drive where memories are stored. You need to maintain a certain amount of RAM to maintain a bandwidth for encoding information. And there are many mechanisms in the hippocampus that support that. And so I definitely think it's like a computer, except that its parallel computing capacity is infinitely greater than many computers that we know, that we're familiar with.
And our last question for this section is, does memory have an emotional component, such as in PTSD?
Yeah, so the hippocampus per se, like as I said, is an encoding device. So it stores information and uses that information to guide behavior. In instances like PTSD, the hippocampus is also involved because the hippocampus essentially regulates or controls emotion circuits in the brain. And so when the hippocampus is disrupted or impaired or damaged, as we know in the case of PTSD, our ability to control the expression of fear, for example, is also impaired. And PTSD is a disorder which is characterized by the inappropriate or abnormal expression of fear. And the dominant thinking, the feel, and certainly something that I subscribe to, is that our ability to appropriately encode our environment is disrupted, and consequently our ability to regulate behaviors associated with fear are also disrupted. So the hippocampus itself does not encode emotion, but it regulates the expression of emotion in an appropriate manner. And so when the hippocampus is damaged, you've got an exaggerated or an aberrant or an inappropriate expression of emotional behavior, as is seen in the case of PTSD.
This is fascinating. Thank you to you two for answering these questions. I'm going to turn it back to Lauren to do the next section, and then again, we'll come back with more questions, and they can be on any of the topics.
All right, so now I'm going to talk about Alzheimer's. So Alzheimer's is one of many forms of dementia, but it's the most common form of dementia. And it's a disease of aging. And in most cases, it starts in the hippocampus, which is why the earliest signs are usually memory loss. But then from there, the damage spreads outwards to other brain regions, and you begin to have problems with speech, with planning, and ultimately with movement. But this is a very, very slow process that takes place over many years. And in fact, it probably begins maybe 15, 20 years before anyone has any symptoms. So why has it been so hard to come up with a treatment? Well, all brain diseases are hard because they're complicated. But the fact that Alzheimer's begins so early is one of the things that makes it hard. Because if you don't know the cause of a disease, how do you treat it? How do you come up with a treatment? So, but we do know a lot. And one of the things that we knew from the very beginning, from the first patient that Dr. Alois Alzheimer found, was that the characteristic two hallmark signs in the brain are these toxic proteins that gradually build up. And there are the amyloid beta plaques on the left and the tau tangles on the right. And the plaques are the result of this protein being snipped apart in the wrong places so that it clumps together between cells and causes inflammation and is thought to contribute to memory impairments. And then on the right, these tau tangles are made up of tau. Normally is a protein that stabilizes structures in the neuron. But for various reasons, it can sort of fall away from those structures and then get tangled up ultimately into these teardrop shapes inside neurons, and it cuts off communication and kills neurons. Intriguingly, these tau tangles have also been found in young heroin chronic users in Europe in several studies in the hippocampus, one in a young man who was only 17 years old. So that's a possible connection with the opioid-associated amnestic syndrome. So, so the thing that's been very much in the news this week is the FDA approval of Biogen's new drug, Aduhelm. And that is based on the prevailing theory for about 30 years that the cause of Alzheimer's disease are these amyloid beta plaques, that they are the first thing to go wrong. And then if we can get rid of them, we will treat people effectively for Alzheimer's disease. And so it's called the amyloid cascade hypothesis. And the idea really made a lot of sense with the data that scientists were coming up with in the 1990s and the 2000s. So the 3 genes that cause familial Alzheimer's, which is rare, is a rare form of the disease, are all involved in how amyloid beta gets processed. They also found with the advent of PET scans that allow you to see where these proteins are, that people with Alzheimer's disease have a lot of amyloid beta collected in the brain. And then the third reason was that when they engineered mice to create lots of amyloid beta, these mice had memory impairments. And then when they cleared the amyloid out of the brain, the mice's memory improved. So it made a lot of sense to think if we do the same thing with people, we'll make people better. But in 25 trials beginning back in 2003, this strategy has never worked. Getting rid of amyloid beta from the brain has never resulted in any measurable improvement in memory. And the FDA's own advisory panel would say that that is also the case for the most recent Biogen trials, which is different from saying that it doesn't work. It's saying simply that the evidence isn't there right now. And there are possible reasons why it appears not to have worked, but could work. For example, what if it could be started earlier? Maybe they didn't get the treatment going early enough. But there's also a question of, it's hard to do these clinical trials right, and not just getting people early enough, but getting the right people. So in a couple of studies that were well along, they found out that 30% of the people who were enrolled in the trial did not actually even have amyloid beta. So if you're looking for a drug that is probably going to have a subtle effect, and 30% of your people don't even have the disease you're targeting, you're not going to be able to pick the signal out of the noise. But it's also quite likely, and I think Amar would talk more about this, that there isn't a cause for Alzheimer's, that there are probably many causes for Alzheimer's and different flavors of Alzheimer's and different on-ramps for Alzheimer's, which means you might need different treatments for different people. So this is all sounding very depressing, but I will say that starting with Amar, who was the first Alzheimer's researcher I actually spoke with over at Panera, that there is more of a sense of optimism now because there's a willingness to look outside the spotlight and look beyond amyloid beta at other strategies. And also there's better tools now. So the other protein, ironically, that people are looking at that is relatively new are the tau tangles that Alzheimer's saw in the very first patient. And the thought is that that might be a better target because tau tangles accumulate in the hippocampus, which is where the memory impairment occurs. And as tau tangles spread outward, that spread tracks with the symptoms and the brain damage that are associated with Alzheimer's in a way that amyloid beta doesn't. In fact, people can have a lot of amyloid beta and have no memory problems whatsoever. One of the neuroscientists I spoke with about amyloid beta said, it's kind of like, the fire department shows up because the smoke alarms are going off and they walk in, they turn off the smoke alarms and they leave thinking they've solved the problem, but the fire is still burning. So, in that way of looking at it, amyloid beta is like the smoke alarms. There's a problem here, but it doesn't mean that the smoke alarms are the problem. So tau is one thing that's in clinical trials, but there are many other strategies that people are trying. And the attitude is now, let's sort of take as many shots on goal as we can. So I describe a couple of really interesting strategies in the book. One of them, it's called gamma entrainment. So gamma is a brain rhythm. It oscillates 40 times a second. And in Alzheimer's, people with Alzheimer's, it's weaker. So in this treatment, which is now in clinical trials, but was tried first in mice, you expose the mice to flickering light or flickering audio at 40 hertz, and it entrains the gamma rhythms in the brain and makes them stronger. And these mice, their memory improved with an hour of exposure a day for a week. And the microglia, which are the cells in the brain that are sort of the house cleaning cells that clear out toxic proteins like amyloid beta plaques and tau tangles, they got bigger so they could do their job. The vasculature got bigger, which theoretically might make it easier for the brain to clean itself out. So that is in clinical trials now through a company and at MIT. And that's completely non-invasive, obviously. You just expose yourself to this light. And no one really understands why it would have that effect, why improved gamma rhythm would have all these amazing effects. But if it works, it works. Another strategy that I'm looking at that's also that I describe in the book looks at hyperactivity in the hippocampus. So in older people, and especially people in the earlier stages of Alzheimer's, you get a lot of activity in the hippocampus, which originally researchers thought, oh, that's the brain's way of making up for faltering communication, and that's a good thing. And maybe we should improve that. But it turns out to be exactly the opposite, and it's more like noise in the system that prevents the brain from forming memories. So the strategy here is actually a reformulated off-the-shelf epilepsy drug that is designed to just tamp down that hyperactivity enough so that it doesn't interfere with memory formation. Now, none of these treatments, people aren't talking about cures. They're talking about slowing down the progression of the disease by even a few years could make a huge difference in the number of people who have Alzheimer's disease. And there are many other strategies that people are looking at. They're looking at other ways of improving brain clearance. They're looking at resilience factors. One of the things that kind of set the field in the wrong direction for a while was that the first mouse models for Alzheimer's actually had resilience genes that made them more resistant to the effects of plaques and tangles and other disease. So that was good news for the mice, but bad news for testing drugs. But what are those resilience factors? People talk about a renaissance now, that there are so many new tools, ways to identify people sooner, ways to make little brains in a dish, in a petri dish. And so before you even get to mice, being able to screen many, many treatments and really speeding it up. So people talk about, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, that there will be treatments coming online. And I also want to point out that one of the hypotheses to come out of the opioid-associated amnestic syndrome is it could be a similar phenomenon to this hyperactivity in the hippocampus. And if this overactivity is what's causing memory impairment, could finding a way to counteract that be effective? So if opioids are causing the hippocampus to get overexcited, could you use an anti-opioid? For example, naltrexone, which is a drug that's used for people with opioid use disorder or alcoholism that blocks the effect of opioids. Could that help people and help stave off memory loss? So, as I went around, there have been so many failures. I think it's very hard to be an Alzheimer's researcher. And I asked one person, how do you keep going? It just seems so depressing. And he said, no, actually, being an Alzheimer's researcher is an inherently optimistic choice because it assumes that there's some light at the end of the tunnel. And that if you keep on walking, you'll get there. But in the meantime, there is great evidence, and Amar can talk more about this, or Jed, that just basically taking care of your health and taking care of your brain can be hugely beneficial in building up this what's called cognitive reserve, which is the ability to keep functioning even in the face of damage that might be happening behind the scenes. People can really compensate for it and have amyloid beta and sometimes tau and still be functioning well on the outside. So Exercise, diet, sleep, learning new things, all of those things are really thought to help reduce your risk for having, the outward symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. So with that, I will turn it over for questions for the real experts here.
Thank you. I'm going to bring Jed and Amr back on camera again in case there are any questions. And again, I will watch chat and Q&A and hands to see if anybody has anything to ask. And again, I have a question to fill a minute while people are thinking of their questions. Is there hope that the research being done on the hippocampus might connect to research for Alzheimer's? I can't remember from reading the book if there's a direct connection between the research that Jed is trying to work through and research for treating Alzheimer's.
And probably Amar can talk about it more broadly than I can. I think Lauren kind of mentioned, I think one of the things that we're looking at hypothetically is whether medications that block opioids could potentially have an impact on disease progression. So naloxone is like a shorter acting version of an opioid blocker, and naltrexone is a longer acting version of that. And there is some evidence that that with aging, you actually have endogenous opioids, which are opioids that your own body produces, and that those rise with age. And there's some evidence also that in mild cognitive impairment, which is the precursor stage to Alzheimer's, that the hippocampus is actually hyperactive, and that if you treat that hyperactivity, it seems to be beneficial for cognition. So the idea of the opioid blockade is if you have, endogenous opioids with aging that are, at increasing levels, and you block those opioids, can you in turn reduce the hyperactivity in the hippocampus and potentially slow the progression of mild cognitive impairment to Alzheimer's. And actually, I think in a clinical realm, that would be probably more important than the treatments we have now, because the treatments we have now are for treating Alzheimer's itself and slowing the pace of Alzheimer's. People with mild cognitive impairment have memory loss, but by definition have preserved functional abilities, and generally still retain independence. So the longer that you can keep somebody independent, and functioning independently, the more valued I think a treatment would be. So that's one of the things that we're considering, but it's going to take a lot of work to, I think, get there. And we're starting to try to look at that as a possible like early stage trial to see if there's a mechanism there that works, and if so, would it work in the long run?
And one of the questions in chat is, did anyone look for tau tangles in the fentanyl overdose cases?
So we're doing a project, a pilot project now, trying to look at that, but it's a really small sample. So it's one of these types of things where we probably have to collect a number of patients at maybe different exposures and different ages to kind of see, to see if that holds true. But that's something that's interesting that we're thinking about. And it is possible also that people with the syndrome, could potentially, develop tau tangles for some period of time, and maybe the mechanism to clear those tau tangles is in place such that they don't maintain them. So, but we're considering that possibility. So we are investigating that.
One of the initial challenges that was documented in the book was the difficulty of finding other patients with similar conditions, right? And you put out the second notice asking people if they'd come across it. And a lot of people had said, yeah, I saw that once 4 years ago. I didn't get to do the scans, or it's been too long now. I can't find the patient. The patient isn't still with us. Has there been any improvement, or do you have any thoughts on how to improve that kind of communication to increase the collaboration? Because to your earlier point about having a large enough data sample, you know, you need enough people or patients, you need enough data to start making some connections and developing some hypotheses. But if there's a difficulty in communicating across the country or around the world to find that, you know, how do you improve on that first step?
So there's probably, I think there's kind of two components to that. One is how common is that syndrome in reality? We don't actually know. I mean, I think, you know, a lot of the patients who may overdose may never come to the attention of, you know, to medical professionals. The ones who come to the attention of medical professionals, you know, if they have memory loss, especially in the acute phase, it might be attributed to acute intoxication rather than like a focal damage from the drug. And even beyond that, you know, very few emergency rooms, for example, have the capacity to do an MRI acutely. And so they may get sent home before kind of the type of imaging that would detect the damage would be done. So there's a lot of barriers to figuring out like how many people there are. We're working on a study based on kind of Massachusetts databases to see if we can maybe come up with a rough ballpark estimate of how many people, you know, may be affected. And then, you know, the second component of that is, you know, in terms of getting people connected, I think is building awareness. And that's, you know, that's been a lot of kind of what we've been trying to do through, you know, publishing our work. And, you know, obviously, I think, you know, we've been fortunate to get, you know, some broad media coverage over the past few years. And I think that's helped a lot in terms of connecting people. For example, Owen in the book, you know, had read about it, and that's how he wound up coming into the attention of, you know, the medical profession. So I think that type of attention, and probably you know, I think this book in and of itself will bring hopefully, you know, more attention to the syndrome and to, you know, these kinds of issues related to it. And I think that those are the types of things, you know, figuring out, you know, how much of a problem it is, and then, you know, trying to raise awareness of the problem. I think if you know, bring those things together, you wind up you wind up getting closer to, you know, solving some of these issues with what you're talking about.
I was thinking about that as you were speaking, that the value of a book like Lauren's is that it pulls the pieces together and tells a story so that people understand that this is happening, and they might see themselves or someone they know in it. It's a very readable book. I did read an advanced copy. Thank you, Lauren. Just because I wanted to be prepared for this conversation. So I'll tell people out there, it is very readable. We have ordered a copy for the library. I think, yeah, telling the story to raise awareness is definitely an important part of the process. Another question in chat, I thought the anti-opioid medication blocked the action on the quote unquote pleasure centers, wherever those are. I don't really understand the question, so I don't know which one of you is best to speak to that.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the opioid, you know, the opioid antagonists block they block the mu receptor. So I mean, I guess they can block the, you know, they block the effect of the opioid. So if there's, I guess, theoretically pleasure derived from taking an opioid, they would block that pleasure.
So a question in Q&A, how does learning new things, and this person jokes quantum physics, delay the onset of dementia? What kinds of new things look promising? I assume for delaying the onset.
I can take a stab at that. I don't think there's a prescription. I think what they've found is that you need to do something challenging. So it can't just be, you know, the same crossword over and over again. It has to be, you know, the same thing with exercising. You're not going to get stronger if you don't push yourself. So it has to be really learning something new. And so quantum mechanics is, one way to go, I would think.
Does anyone else want to add something on that?
Well, we just know from basic neuroscience, so studies in rats and mice that enrichment, learning, uh, all promote changes in the brain, from changes in numbers of synapses to the generation of new neurons, and all of these different plasticity mechanisms support learning and memory. So I would also bet on, exercises, whether it be physical exercise or enrichment or continuous learning, as a safe bet to slow down cognitive decline in humans, in us, that is.
We did host a program at the library. I can't remember anything about time right now, so I don't remember when it was. It might have been last November. We hosted somebody who talked about Alzheimer's specifically, and he did go, I think he's an author of a book called 7 Steps to Managing Memory. And he did talk about different ways. It's not just learning new things, and it's not just crossword puzzles and Sudoku, but it's also being social, and it's also doing things that bring you joy so that you're staying engaged in your life. And there's a variety of different things that you can do beyond what we typically think of. So that program was recorded and is on our YouTube channel. So if anybody is interested specifically in Alzheimer's, you are welcome to go back and view that. So there's another question in chat. We are coming up to 8:30. So if anybody has a question, you have about 1 more minute to get it into chat or Q&A. And I do see one raised hand. So let me ask this question in chat, and then I'll go to the raised hand. The question is, so why assume antagonists will help hippocampus? And I'm not sure if antagonists is a typo. Does that make sense to the?
Yeah, I think this is I think what we were kind of discussing before is that the idea that if you have rising levels of opioids that your body produces as you age, and that as people who age may develop mild cognitive impairment, the precursor to dementia, and the mild cognitive impairment is associated with hippocampal hyperactivity on scans. The question is it possible there's a connection between the rising opioid levels, for example, that your body produces, and that hyperactivity that you see on the scans? If you give an opioid blocker, can you reduce that hyperactivity in a beneficial way, slow the progression from mild cognitive impairment to Alzheimer's, and have a a useful treatment that way? That's the hypothesis. There's nothing there's nothing actually demonstrating that. Those are things that we're interested in putting to a trial.
So many opportunities for trials. So I'm going to let our last question be from our raised hand, Sandra Macy. I've just given you permission to talk. And so if you want to unmute yourself, you can ask your question out loud.
Okay, thank you. I'm curious to know what is the difference or the connection between dementia and Alzheimer's? It seems that there are times when people use those terms interchangeably.
So dementia is more of an umbrella term that includes Alzheimer's. So dementia is basically, by definition, when somebody has trouble with cognition, and it's most commonly memory, but trouble with cognition that's progressive over time, and impairs daily function. I mean, that's kind of the brief synopsis of what dementia is. And Alzheimer's is the most common type of that dementia. So, Alzheimer's dementia probably accounts for something like, 85% of, all dementia cases. It may be a give or take, but it's the vast majority of them. And then a smaller percentage of dementia cases are from other causes.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much. So with that, I am going to bring George back up on screen, and I will come back as well. I would like to thank all of our audience members for their patience in joining us tonight. I apologize again for the delay and the technology difficulties, but thank you for coming in and staying with us. Thank you very much to Lauren, Amr, and Jed for the presentation and the answers to the questions. I think this was a really fascinating discussion. I appreciate your time so much, and I will let George have the last word.
Thank you for the presentation. I thought our start had something to do with memory loss, but I think it's a separate issue. So we'll work on our side on the technology while you work on brain science. But I would like to offer that the book itself presents this same information, but in reading the book, it's much more like a murder mystery. And the suspense as you go from section to section makes wonderful reading. I won't place it as a question, but I worked on identifying dementia 25 years ago, and we gave up the hunt because wherever we found it, we didn't have a cure for it. So nobody wanted to spend any money on finding it because then they didn't know what the hell to do with it. So you are deeply engaged in finding a solution for a very important question and problem in our society. And I thank you for doing what you've done and the research that you're doing. And I hope that through perhaps what we're doing right at this moment, educating more people, that you find more support for your research, and that you are moving this ball forward in a way that society improves. But the book itself is good reading, and I encourage anyone who's interested in listening to actually read the book and not rely just on this wonderful presentation. Thank you very much for tonight and for everything that you're doing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great night.